She slammed the paper down and yelled, "Just sign it." And in that moment, everything between us changed forever. He hadn't planned on seeing her today. The very thought of entering that office made his chest tighten as if the air itself had grown heavier. The hallway outside was unnervingly silent, the faint echo of his shoes on the polished floor marking each hesitant step. He could smell the faint antiseptic of the building mingled with the subtle scent of her perfume, the memory of it still lodged deep in his mind. When he pushed open the door, there she was, standing behind a sleek, dark desk with the authority of someone used to control, her posture straight, shoulders squared. She wore a tailored blazer that framed her graceful form, her hair falling softly across one shoulder. She looked calm, composed, almost untouchable, but he caught the flicker of something else, something fragile in the tight line of her jaw and the brief hesitation of her fingers resting on the desk. That small, human detail was enough to unnerve him. Her eyes locked on his as he stepped in, and he felt a wave of unspoken history crash over him. Years of shared moments, conversations, silences, and laughter, all compressed into a single glance. There was a strange combination of warmth and distance in her gaze, as though she was simultaneously inviting him in and warning him to stay away. The attorney seated to the side cleared his throat, a polite but deliberate reminder of the reality that this was not a casual meeting. The tension in the room thickened, settling like a heavy blanket over his shoulders. He could feel his own hands start to sweat, the pen in his pocket suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she rested her hands on the desk, long fingers brushing against each other in a rhythm that somehow seemed impatient yet restrained. Then, in a tone both sharp and controlled, she said, "Just sign it." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was impossible to ignore. There was no room for negotiation, no hint of compromise. And yet, beneath that authority, he sensed something unspoken, a flicker of vulnerability that only someone who had known her closely could see. He moved forward slowly, his mind running through every argument he could make, every emotion he had buried over the past months. Resentment. Regret. Lingering desire. And somewhere deep beneath all of it, the faint echo of care he hadn't quite abandoned. Sitting across from her, he noticed the subtle details, the way the sunlight caught the strands of her hair, the way her brow furrowed for just a moment, the tiny tremor in her hand as she reached for the papers. Each detail was a reminder that beneath the professional facade, she was still very human. The room felt smaller with every heartbeat. Every glance, every pause, every slight shift of weight carried a tension that made it impossible to focus solely on the legal matter at hand. He knew this wasn't just about signing a document. It was about acknowledging a history, an unresolved connection that neither of them had fully admitted, even to themselves. As he reached for the pen, his hand hovered over the paper, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. He had entered the office expecting a transaction. Instead, he found a confrontation not just with her demands, but with every suppressed feeling that had quietly defined the space between them for years. He sat across from her, the weight of the signed, or yet to be signed, paper resting heavily between them. The attorney's presence at the side of the room made the space feel even smaller, as if every heartbeat was amplified, every subtle movement scrutinized. There was no sound except the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere on the wall. And yet, the silence was not empty, it was full of everything left unsaid. His eyes couldn't help but wander. Not in a way that was inappropriate, but instinctively, drawn to the small details that had always lingered in his memory. The way her hair caught the light from the office window, golden strands glinting against the darker tones of her blazer. The tilt of her chin when she was thinking, subtle but commanding. The gentle furrow of her brow that betrayed a hint of worry beneath her otherwise composed expression. Each detail, each imperfection, made her more human, more real, and somehow more unattainable at the same time. He could feel her eyes on him, too, though she did not speak. They met his gaze and held it, neither retreating, neither giving in. There was an unspoken conversation happening there, a dialogue of glances and micro-expressions that carried more weight than words ever could. Every pause, every inhale, every subtle lean forward created a rhythm of tension he felt in his chest. He became acutely aware of how close they were, how the space between them seemed to shrink with every shared second of quiet. His hand brushed against the corner of the paper, and he noticed the almost imperceptible twitch in her fingers as she shifted her weight on the chair. The sound of her pen tapping lightly against the desk was maddening in its steadiness, each tap echoing in his mind like a countdown. He remembered how she used to tap her fingers when she was nervous, not at work, but in private, when the walls were down. That memory made his stomach twist with something he couldn't name. He wanted to speak, to fill the silence with words that might explain his hesitation, his resentment, his lingering feelings, but the words caught in his throat. And so they remained there, suspended in the air, letting the tension grow organically. The audience should feel the heaviness of unspoken emotion, the magnetic pull between two people who had history and unresolved connection. He thought about the past, the quiet dinners where conversation flowed effortlessly, the stolen moments of laughter, the warmth of her hand brushing his. And yet, here they were, formal and distant, surrounded by legal authority, forced to navigate the same closeness without the safety of intimacy. The contrast made his chest tighten, made him hyper-aware of every small movement, the way her eyes lingered on him a split second too long, the way her lips pressed into a thin line as she considered her next move. Time stretched. Every second was a test of patience, restraint, and unspoken emotion. In the stillness of that office, with the attorney quietly observing and the documents sitting between them like a barrier, he realized how much power silence could hold. Not just silence, but charged, electric, meaningful silence. The room was no longer just an office, it was a battleground of memory, desire, and hesitation. And as he finally lifted his gaze fully to meet hers again, he understood, this wasn't merely about signing a piece of paper. This was a confrontation with everything he had tried to ignore, every subtle pull of emotion that neither time nor distance had managed to erase. The words hit the room like a sudden clap of thunder. "Just sign it," she said, her voice sharp, commanding, but not without a trace of something else, something he had learned to recognize over time, vulnerability hidden beneath authority. The paper slid slightly toward him, her hand brushing against the edge, and he felt a jolt, an electric reminder of their closeness, a spark of tension that had nothing to do with the legal matter at hand. He froze for a moment, his pen still hovering above the page. The authority in her tone demanded compliance, but his eyes couldn't leave hers. There was an intensity there, a pull that tugged at memories he had tried to lock away. The faint crease between her brows, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders stiffened, all of it told him she was as human as he was, conflicted and uncertain beneath the professional mask. The attorney sat silently to the side, watching, a quiet shadow that made the tension almost unbearable. Every movement, every inhale, every micro-expression felt magnified. He noticed her fingers again, slightly trembling as they rested on the desk, brushing occasionally against the paper. He wondered, for a fleeting moment, if she even realized it. The smallest gestures had always spoken volumes between them, long before words could. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, aware of the tiny tremor in his own hand as he reached for the pen. He remembered the countless moments where their connection had been subtle but undeniable, the brief touch of her hand on his arm, the way her gaze lingered just a little too long, the quiet laughter they shared in private corners of the world. Each memory pressed against the present moment, making compliance feel like surrender, and defiance feel impossible. Why is this so hard, he thought, though the words remained trapped in his mind. The paper in front of him was simple, official, mundane to anyone else. But to them, it was a symbol of history, of unresolved feelings, of the invisible tether that had never fully broken. His eyes traced the lines of her face, the subtle warmth in her expression despite her assertive words, and he realized the intensity wasn't just in her command, it was in the closeness they were forced to navigate again, in the gravity of seeing each other after months of distance. He finally made a move, his fingers brushing hers as he shifted slightly to take the paper. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a ripple through both of them. It was the kind of touch that lingered in memory long after it ended, warm, familiar, and charged with emotion. He caught her eyes again, noticing the flash of surprise, or was it recognition? And the brief softening in her features. The room seemed to shrink around them. The tension between them was almost physical, pressing into his chest, quickening his heartbeat. He realized that this moment, this simple act of signing, was no longer just about a document. It was about power and vulnerability, control and surrender, the push and pull of everything they had been to each other. And so he paused, pen in hand, breathing in the charged atmosphere, knowing that the next few seconds would carry more weight than anything else in the room. Signing the paper would be easy. Navigating the emotions it stirred, that would take far longer. As his pen touched the paper, a wave of memories hit him like a sudden gust of wind, pulling him backward through time. The room, the polished desk, the stiff leather chairs, the sterile lighting, seemed to fade for a moment. All he could see were fragments of the past, flashes of quiet moments that had once felt infinite and safe. He remembered the way she used to laugh when he said something awkward, that soft, melodic laugh that always seemed to fill the room and linger in the air long after. He remembered sitting across from her at a small cafe on a rainy afternoon, her hand accidentally brushing his as they reached for the sugar, the shock of warmth sending an unspoken message neither had dared to voice. Each memory was vivid, the curve of her smile, the warmth of her eyes, the subtle, comforting scent that always seemed to follow her, the faint brush of her hair against his arm. The office around him came back into focus, but now it felt layered with history. Every subtle gesture, the way her hand rested on the desk, the slight tilt of her head, the soft inhale she took when waiting for his signature, echoed the intimacy they had shared long ago. The memory of her hand brushing against his own as they passed a book, of her lingering gaze when she thought he wasn't looking, pressed against the present like a quiet ache. He caught a fleeting expression on her face, a softened look that he recognized immediately, one he had memorized during countless conversations and stolen moments. There was a vulnerability there, barely visible beneath her composed exterior, but he could see it clearly. It mirrored his own internal turmoil, a mix of longing, regret, and the faint, almost forbidden pull that still existed between them. Every second stretched. The paper in front of him was mundane, yet it had never felt so heavy. It was more than ink on a page, it was a symbol of everything they had left unspoken, every connection they had never fully acknowledged. And yet, the memories were bittersweet. They reminded him of the warmth they had shared and the distance that now existed, the delicate balance between affection and restraint that had always defined their bond. He hesitated for a long moment, his hand hovering over the pen, feeling the weight of her presence across from him. He remembered brushing her hair behind her ear once, the lingering closeness that had set his heart racing. He remembered the way her eyes had held his, unguarded, just long enough to leave a mark on him. Those memories weren't just echoes, they were living, tangible reminders of everything that had brought them to this quiet, tension-filled room. And then he signed. The action was small, almost perfunctory, but the emotional weight behind it was monumental. Every memory, every touch, every lingering glance they had ever shared seemed to pulse between them in that single, silent act. He looked up, meeting her eyes once more, and in that instant, they both recognized the truth, nothing was ever truly over. Even in the stillness of that office, the air between them was charged with history, longing, and unspoken emotion. The past had surfaced fully, reminding them that their connection was not bound by papers, rules, or reason. It lived in moments, in touches, in glances, in the quiet spaces where neither dared to speak. He handed the signed document back to her, the paper sliding across the desk like a quiet acknowledgement of what had been demanded, and what had been felt. The office seemed to hold its breath in that moment. The attorney remained still, observing the transaction with the precision of someone who had seen countless deals, yet unaware of the storm of emotion passing silently between the two of them. She didn't immediately reach for the paper. Instead, her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a heartbeat, the formal barrier melted. He saw a flicker of hesitation in her gaze, a subtle softness that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the history they shared. There was a small part of him that longed to reach out, to bridge the space between them with the smallest of gestures, but he stayed seated, aware of the unspoken rule of restraint. The air felt thick, almost tangible. He noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the room, familiar and intimate, a reminder of days past. He shifted slightly in his chair, the scrape of leather against the floor seeming impossibly loud. Every minor movement carried weight, the brushing of his sleeve against the edge of the desk, the subtle click of the pen as he placed it down, the exhale that escaped him unconsciously. She mirrored him in stillness, her posture poised yet betraying a tension she didn't fully mask. As he stood, the room seemed to shrink, compressing around him with the gravity of everything unsaid. He felt the pull of the past in every step toward the door, the lingering memory of her hand brushing his, the quiet laughter shared in empty rooms, the warmth of her presence during late-night conversations. Each memory tugged at him, making it harder to move forward, harder to leave. When he finally reached the door, he paused. For a split second, he considered turning back, speaking, or even just glancing over his shoulder, but he knew the moment had passed. The gesture would carry weight he wasn't ready to shoulder, and the unspoken acknowledgement between them was already enough. The office seemed impossibly still as he crossed the threshold. He could feel her eyes following him, and though he didn't look back, he imagined the small movements she made, the slight exhale, the way her hands rested on the desk, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. It was an intimate recognition, quiet yet profoundly charged. Outside, the corridor felt vast in contrast to the compressed intimacy of the office. The air hit him like a sudden wave, sharp and cold, bringing him back to the present. His shoulders, tight with the accumulated tension of the past hour, slowly began to relax. Yet even as he walked away, the memory of her presence lingered, like a warm shadow trailing him. Every step was measured, reflective. He realized that leaving didn't erase the connection between them. The conversation they hadn't had, the touches they hadn't shared, the tension that had filled the room, they all remained, quietly imprinting themselves on his mind. It wasn't a physical closeness, but an emotional one, a recognition that some bonds couldn't simply be severed by distance or formality. By the time he reached the elevator, the reality of departure settled in. He had done what was required, followed the demands of the moment, but the emotional undercurrent remained, alive and unbroken. He knew the story between them wasn't over, not in memory, not in heart. The office had become more than a place for signatures, it had become a stage for lingering connection, subtle intimacy, and the quiet pull of something neither of them could fully let go. He stepped out of the building and into the crisp air, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly large after the confined tension of the office. The sunlight hit his face, warm but not enough to erase the chill lingering in his chest. Every step away from the door felt heavier than it should, as if gravity itself was anchored to the memories he had just confronted. He walked slowly, almost deliberately, needing time to process what had just transpired, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing at his ribs. Even as the city moved around him, the faint hum of traffic, distant chatter, the rhythm of life, his mind replayed the office, every detail etched vividly. The brush of her hand against his, the quiet command in her voice, the subtle shift in her expression when she realized how much he hesitated. He could almost feel her presence trailing behind him, a warm, invisible tether he couldn't cut. He paused at the curb, glancing back, almost against his better judgment. Through the large glass window, he could see her framed in the office, her silhouette calm, poised, yet unmistakably aware of his gaze. She hadn't moved, hadn't turned away, just stood there, a quiet sentinel of everything they had shared. He imagined the slight tilt of her head, the soft exhale she probably released as the office returned to its usual stillness. That simple observation made his heart ache and swell at the same time. The memory of her was not just visual. He felt the warmth of her hand, remembered the soft brush of her hair against his cheek, the subtle intimacy of shared glances and unspoken acknowledgement. Even in leaving, he was acutely aware of the emotional resonance she carried. It was the kind of connection that didn't require proximity to be felt, one that lingered in the chest, in the breath, in the quiet corners of the mind where no one else could intrude. He walked a few more steps, letting the air fill his lungs, grounding himself in the present while the past clung stubbornly to his thoughts. The city noises became a backdrop to the lingering tension, the emotional gravity that followed him like a shadow. He realized, in a quiet, undeniable way, that this bond, frustrating, complicated, and unresolved, would not simply fade. Not with distance. Not with signed papers. Not with time. He thought about the subtle ways she had affected him, the way her eyes could communicate more than words ever could, the small gestures of care hidden in everyday interactions, the quiet strength that contrasted so sharply with the tenderness she allowed herself in rare moments. Those details, so easily overlooked by anyone else, were seared into his memory. Even as he continued walking, he could feel the pull of her presence, gentle yet persistent. The memory of the office, of her gaze, of the unspoken tension, stayed with him like a melody you can't stop humming. It was comforting, painful, and strangely beautiful all at once, a reminder that some connections linger long after the final goodbye, shaping who you are and what you carry forward. And as he finally reached a quieter street, turning the corner into the anonymity of the city, he realized something profound: leaving the office didn't mean leaving her behind. The bond, however complicated, remained a silent, invisible thread connecting them across space and time. He stopped at the edge of the street, letting the evening light wash over him. The day had shifted in subtle, irreversible ways. Small gestures, fleeting glances, and unspoken words had left marks on both of them. Even as he moved forward, the echoes of the office lingered, vibrating quietly in his chest like a chord that refused to fade. He realized, with a bittersweet clarity, that some connections do not end simply because circumstances demand it, they leave a trace, shaping who you are long after the moment has passed. Her image remained vivid in his mind, the way she had held herself so composedly, the strength and grace mingled with quiet vulnerability, the subtle tremor in her hands that betrayed the tension she tried to hide. There had been moments when their proximity had almost been too much, the brush of her fingers against his, the lingering gaze, the way the sunlight had illuminated her hair just so. Those moments weren't dramatic, they were quiet, restrained, yet they carried more weight than words could convey. He imagined her now, standing by the window in the office, still and composed, yet undeniably aware of the distance he had put between them. He knew she was thinking of him, just as he was thinking of her, not in anger or regret, but in that strange, complicated place where affection and respect and longing overlap. They had both acknowledged, without speaking aloud, that what existed between them couldn't be undone by signed papers or formalities. It was inescapable, enduring, and quietly transformative. Walking further down the street, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The tension that had weighed on him all day had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted, becoming softer, reflective, less jagged. He understood that the connection they shared didn't require resolution in the conventional sense. There were no declarations, no promises, no guarantees. Just acknowledgement, a quiet, mutual recognition of what had been, what remained, and what could never fully be erased. He thought back on every fleeting touch, every subtle smile, every unspoken word that had defined their history. The signed document had closed one chapter, yes, but the emotional story between them was far from over. It lived in memory, in the quiet intimacy of shared experiences, in the way their presence had always affected one another. That realization brought a strange comfort, a sense of closure without needing to close completely. As he reached the corner, he paused and took a deep breath, letting the city's sounds fill him, distant voices, the hum of cars, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. He felt the lingering warmth of her presence, almost like a shadow beside him, and he smiled faintly. The bond between them had endured, not because of proximity or circumstance, but because it was real, nuanced, and human. In that moment, he understood something profound: life moves forward, people move apart, but some connections leave a permanent imprint on the heart. They had shared something that transcended the formality of papers or the rigidity of rules. And even as he walked away, carrying the weight and the memory of her, he knew that she would remain a quiet, enduring presence in his life, untouchable yet deeply felt, fleeting yet unforgettable. And somewhere, across the office window, she likely felt it too, a silent acknowledgement, a soft exhale of recognition, the faintest hint of a smile, knowing that some bonds, however complicated, never truly fade.